morning, depending on where you are. Welcome to this live session, the first that we're doing with Tom, really. Welcome. We would love to know where you are connecting from, and of course, who's attending. So please do say hi in the chat, so we know where you're connecting from, and maybe tell us a little bit about yourself. Let's start with introducing ourselves. Tom, do you want to start?
Sure. My name is Tom Clement, and I am an assistant professor of management and entrepreneurship at Minnesota State University, Mankato. For those not familiar, we're about an hour south of the Twin Cities of Minneapolis and St. Paul in the United States. I've been teaching in entrepreneurship for over 20 years now, and I'm also an entrepreneur on the side, which we'll kind of talk a little bit more about that background in a bit. But right now, I'm a licensed contractor as well, and I do a little bit of house flipping and that kind of stuff, handiwork, I guess they would call it. So I'm glad to be here. This is going to be fun.
Great. So my name is Inge. I am from the Netherlands. I'm connecting from the Netherlands as well. What really marked my life is I've lived for a long time, for about 11 years in Colombia. That's where most of my experience with entrepreneurship also comes from. Used to work for the Ministry of ICT in Colombia for a very big nationwide accelerator program. That's where a lot of people know me from. And I used to teach entrepreneurship innovation at a couple of universities, both in the Netherlands as well as in Colombia. And from that experience, I've created a serious game which is called a Playground for Entrepreneurs. So it's basically a tool for educators and coaches to work with entrepreneurs and with students of entrepreneurship. So today we are going to discuss competition. And competition is a very interesting subject. As entrepreneurship professionals, we always get a lot of entrepreneurs saying they actually don't have competition, which is very frustrating for entrepreneurship professionals because we know there's always competition. So what they usually refer to is that they don't have any direct competition, but there are so many more ways of competing. So being very clear about that and exploring competition in that sense is always very useful for entrepreneurs. So that's what we want to discuss today. So let's start with the story.
Yes. So this is going back a number of years, over 20 years ago. I was in what we call in the United States the power sports business, which I sold motorcycles and ATVs and snowmobiles and watercraft, all the adult toys that people have fun with on the weekends and whatnot. And in the beginning, when I started this business, I was only about 25 years old. So it was a huge undertaking. It was my first real true entrepreneurial venture. So I also was doing a lot of the things around the business myself. So I was basically the main salesperson. And I was working with a customer one afternoon, and this gentleman was interested in buying an ATV, which is, just a four-wheel off-road vehicle. And I worked with him and I worked with him and I put all the right numbers down, and he was extremely interested. And for some reason that day, I just could not close the sale. And he was one of these individuals that just had to go and sleep on it. So he left the store, which, was kind of a bummer. And I didn't hear back from him for a long time. And about 2 weeks later, I ran into him. I was having lunch and I ran into him at the restaurant that I was at. And we didn't leave on bad terms. So I just walked up and said hello and just asked him, what did you ever end up doing with an ATV? I sort of assumed he just went to another store, another dealer, and bought one from someone else. Maybe they had a better price or better features or whatever. And he kind of got a little bit embarrassed and he kind of hung his head and looked at the floor and he goes, "Wow." I went home and talked to my wife about it, and we ended up buying a hot tub. And that was a huge moment for me. It was like one of those initial light bulb moments when you're a young entrepreneur. And I realized that, I was so hyper focused on my competition, which I assumed to be other dealers like myself, other people selling motorcycles and ATVs. And I didn't realize at the time that I was basically competing for people's discretionary dollars. that leftover money that people have at the end of the month or the end of the week or 2 weeks or whatever, that they use to go have fun, or they use it to repair something around the home that's not critical, but something that they'd like to do, like maybe a remodeling project. And even in later years, I had customers tell me that, wow, I didn't buy that motorcycle, but my wife and I decided to go to Hawaii, on vacation or something like that. And that's a big moment when you realize that your competition is not necessarily who you think it is. And I even had students that come to me a lot, and anybody that teaches entrepreneurship can identify, sort of as you discussed, and you'll have a student come in super excited and they'll say, I have this idea and I've never seen anything like it before out there. And usually that's not necessarily a good thing all the time. And it sort of ties back to that competition thing. So that was kind of my story. And that was a big moment for me with sort of the competitive landscape and putting things in context of who really are your competitors, and for most seasoned business people, they kind of know that already, that they're not just competing with other people directly in their business. But for a young entrepreneur, that's a big moment for them.
Yes, definitely. And so often we think about people doing something similar and people doing something as entrepreneurship professionals, we often talk about solving the same problem or solving the same desire. That was not even the case in this particular example, right? So that's really goes back to, I think, economics and even how do you spend your money? You can spend every dollar only once. Where do you spend it on? What's your most urgent need? And in this case, well, the need wasn't life-saving in this sense. It wasn't a basic need, but
Right.
still you were competing with a different need of keeping their wife happy.
Well, and it was a fun and enjoyment thing too. I mean, you think about the ATV was enjoyable maybe for him, but the hot tub that they purchased was enjoyable for both of them. So I mean, that's another factor too that you have to consider. Your audience or your customer when you're working with somebody. If he was just a single guy, not married, no family, I probably would have been able to close that sale that day. But that's just another factor that you need to consider. And I mean, obviously, as a salesperson, you want to be a little bit careful about getting into all the personal information and whatever, but you need to know your audience. You need to know your customer when you talk to them and find out what's important to them and what other things are they considering.
Yeah, yes. And you might not be able to influence all you need in order to make the sale, because in this case it wasn't within your particular influence. You weren't doing something wrong in the sales process to lose the sale. There was just something else that they found more important once they kind of reflected upon it and discussed it at home. So that, I think, is a great eye opener for people to think about where people spend their money. And something else is jobs to be done, which is a very famous theory. For those not familiar, jobs to be done is really about which need are you addressing, what job are you trying to get fixed, and not focusing too much on the product, on the actual solution, until you figure out the problem, until you figure out the job that the customer is going to be done to do, and then fixing it in the best way.
Well, and that anytime you get into any kind of committed relationship, whether it's marriage or just being with somebody in a committed relationship, the jobs to be done change. Your priorities change. It's just like when you have children. If you go that route, you sort of put your own life on the back burner a little bit, and you start to change. That changes that landscape for you from a competitive perspective. And again, that's a demographics thing too. I looked at my core audience. I mean, most of my customers were men, we'll say 35 and older. And you have to consider that demographic very carefully and look for the other things that those individuals are considering, whether it's vacations or hot tubs or, a remodeling project or a new vehicle, like a car or pickup, or something like that, that it's not necessarily something needed. It's definitely a want.
Yes.
But what
Yep.
does that space look like? And I just think there's a lack of context sometimes, because I mean, we ask a lot of young entrepreneurs when they're writing their business plans to put in a section about their competition. And again, like you said at the beginning in the opening, there's a lot of entrepreneurs that assume they don't have any competitors. And again, that's more a lot of times if you're talking a bricks and mortar type of operation on a local level. Well, there's nobody else in the town that's doing this,
Yep.
just like I am. But that doesn't mean you're not competing with other folks in the space that are vying for the dollar that you're trying to have people
Definitely.
spend. And
And
that's
that's really the difference with differentiation, right? Because differentiation is trying to be different. So there's a town with a couple of bakers, and then you try to do something different in terms of baking. But the thing is, people can eat other things as well, right?
right.
So it's not just bread and pastries, it's just something else as well that they can have as a breakfast or a snack. So um, it's really about how you think about competition and when you need to think about how you differentiate if somebody's doing the same in the same type of market, the same type of industry as you are, or if you really are competing with different needs and different jobs to be done, and which is priority at that moment in that particular situation for that particular customer. And then the differentiation is sometimes not even a point.
Well, I even think about the higher ed space that I'm in. You know, you go back 30 years ago, we were competing directly with other colleges and universities for students. Now, I think one of our primary competitors in the higher ed space, especially at the community college level, is with the trades, with the market, with the jobs, because there's not enough young people out there that are able to go out and do uh you know trades work, working on automobiles or doing contracting work like I do on the side and things like that. So I mean, we're not just competing with other colleges and universities or community colleges, we're competing with the market in general, as far as these kids can go out and make a really good income. I mean, there's kids that are going into the trades that are making $50,000-$60,000 a year right away, going out and doing that sort of thing. And if you look at I think the average salary the last time I checked for a graduating management student is around $65,000. But you have that huge cost associated with it. It's going to cost you minimum $30,000, let's say, to go to a 4-year school. So you have that,
Yeah.
that sunk cost that you already have walking out of the door to get
Yeah,
that job. So that's another huge factor.
definitely. Definitely. Meanwhile, in the chat, I see a lot of people saying hi. There's a couple of playground people. There's a couple of former students from Tom.
Yep.
Great to
Hello,
see you
Tanya.
all connecting. And also other people who are interested and who are very welcome, of course. Now there's a question from Mike who is saying, what's the best way for a startup to determine market feasibility when comparing competition? Great question.
It is a great question. It actually brings up a quick point that's a little bit outside of the competition realm. And that's, something that I read from Steve Blank a while back. And if you're not familiar with Blank, he's kind of the lean startup guru, sort of started that whole process. But, he talked about product market fit, which is what we're essentially searching for, whether our customers are accepting of the solution that we're trying to produce. However, product market fit does not mean that the product that we've come up with is viable from a business perspective. So you look at both the feasibility and the viability. Feasibility just means, can we build this? And will anybody be interested perhaps in buying it? That's the product market fit component. But then the other side of that is the viability component. Can we make a business out of this? The story that I always tell my students is with eBay. When eBay first started, and this will make some people laugh, I was a very early user. We used to send paper checks back and forth for the payment for the auctions. We didn't have PayPal. So that was a viability concern back in those days, where you look at market feasibility and viability and what we need to do to make a business work. But as far as the market feasibility thing, like Mike was asking about, that's where customer discovery plays a role to a certain extent. Going out and really trying to talk to the people that you plan to do business with. And it doesn't mean you need to go out and talk to 1,000 people. Sometimes just going out and talking to 100 people can give you a fairly good pulse of what the market is going to look like from a competition perspective. And those people can put you in touch in turn with other people in that space. That's what I spend a lot of time, working with my students on, is trying to, again, Steve Blank's famous saying, get out of the building and get out and start talking to people and try to figure out what's important to them. And that's one of the best ways to determine feasibility. I think we spent too much time as entrepreneurs historically looking at like third-party data, doing research on the internet, trying to figure out what our market feasibility is without actually getting out and talking to anyone. That's a really important component.
Definitely. Now, I really want to emphasize the way that you do that talking with customers. That's really the important thing, because if you don't do it right, the risk is to think that you have validated it and you really haven't. You haven't learned anything at all. So there's a very big body of knowledge about how to do actually customer discovery. We might do another session for that, because there's just so much to it that I can't really resume it in 2 minutes, really. And something else is, what's your market type? Steve Blank, the same Steve Blank, and Bob Dorff, who wrote the Startup Owner's Manual and the Customer Development Manifesto, they also wrote about how to define what type of market you're entering. If you are entering a new market, if people don't know anything like your product, if you're solving something new, if there's really nothing comparable to it, like really, right? Not in the startup pitch type of way, but if there's really something new that you're bringing in and people need to get used to your product, that's probably a marathon. That's going to be a long time, and because you really need to educate people what this does and why it's useful. And once you got the first couple of early adopters, then you can kind of get the ball rolling. But you need a lot of effort in order to get to that mass market.
Well, like you and I chatted about too, when you start talking about commodities, products that are not necessarily easily differentiated one to the other, and that's an increasing list, of different things, and that changes your competitive analysis quite a bit if you're dealing in that particular space, because it's really a lot harder for you to try to figure out a way to differentiate yourself from your competition. And again, that's going to change your strategies as to how you approach that, particular market. And I think there's a lot of perceptive commoditization too. I think there's a lot of markets where people perceive it to be a commodity and it's really not. There is a lot of distinction between the different areas. And I listened to an interview the other day with the founders of Harry's Razors, and they were talking about Gillette and all these large companies that dominated that space. And there was this perception that it was sort of a commodity that was easy to get into. And razor blades are not an easy business to get into. They're very, very intricate. They're very hard to manufacture. And that's one of the reasons why the dominance was there. It wasn't just a dollars and cents thing. In other words, there was a lot that went into that whole process. Inge, talk about your game and your competition. You've got the Playground for Entrepreneurs. It's basically a learning and teaching tool for people thinking about starting a business or learning about starting a business. What were some of the competitive things you faced?
So as for the game, I find that there are a lot of people who are doing innovation games. There's a lot of brainstorming games. There's also a lot of universities doing business simulation games. right? So there's a couple of suppliers and providers, I should say, for business simulation games related to entrepreneurship. Um, the thing is that to really sit down with people and discuss your business idea in a playful way with playful dynamics, that's something that people need to get used to. So, in that sense, I found that the market for the playground for entrepreneurs is really quite new as well. People are not used to playing, and sometimes I even meet people from incubators who pride themselves on their seriousness.
Right.
So, of course, there's this whole research about how playfulness can lead to less tension, can lead people to open up, to share their challenges, to become a bit vulnerable about what they're facing as entrepreneurs and how useful that is. The thing is that these incubators are not applying it.
Right.
So there's a lot of research and a lot of things, and I find that really in terms of competition, people really need to get used to the idea. There's a couple of early adopters. There's a couple of people who, and a couple of people also connected here. Willy, for example, who is a facilitator of the Playground for Entrepreneurs, who's connected right here from the Netherlands. But I found really those early adopters around the world, and that's interesting because they can really get the ball rolling. They can really go. So now, for me, facing that type of market and that type of competition, it's really about opening up the market with my community of facilitators, doing
Well,
this together, right?
well, and it's interesting because one of my jobs at Minnesota State is I teach creativity and innovation, which is actually one of my favorite courses to teach, because one of the things we do to kids is we start off very creative as young kids, but then as we get older and older and older, our creativity diminishes because we're almost shamed for our creativity.
Yeah.
When we're kids, we're making things out of nothing, being very creative, and then as we get older, we sort of go through this phase where we have to be very regimented, like you said, with the incubators. And yet we live in a very gaming culture. I mean, gaming is a huge market, and it's a huge thing with especially with millennials and Gen Zs. And I actually do an assignment in my creativity and innovation class where the students create a game from scratch. We do a board game. It's very analog, just because it's easier for them to get creative on a piece of paper or a board or whatever it is. But it's the best assignment the whole semester. I mean, I think I commented to somebody the other day that one of my pride and joys in teaching was we got so loud one day demonstrating games that the classroom next to us was banging on the wall. They just have a ball playing these games, and they all play each other's games, and then they rate them, and that's part of how they get their grade on the
Yeah,
project.
that's
Um,
great.
so they're competing with
Yeah.
each other as well.
Yeah.
Talk
Yeah.
about competition.
Well,
And so
games are so integrated into our whole lives. We use it in our language all the time, right? When something comes into play, and there's so many sayings around games and play, and there's people learn easier through play. People assimilate things. Children, as you say, learn through play a lot. Social behavior, competition. There's so many things that people use play as a basis, and most of the time, it's even without using it consciously. So it's a very interesting way of actually doing that. Now we should also gamify that process of creating, but you are focusing yourself on sophomore entrepreneurs.
right,
So at a certain point after the first year, it becomes a marathon. Like the adrenaline is gone, and now you need to hold on and build your business really, to build it and to make it um, break even or better profitable. So that's really where we need to face our challenges, and that's the long run. And that is where play can also make such a difference, because that's how we make it nice, and we make it enjoyable on the long run as well.
Well, you talk about the sophomore entrepreneurs, which is kind of a passion of mine. I think we spend a lot of time in entrepreneurship, and rightly so, talking about startups and pre-startups, getting ready to get the business going, which is important. But then we sort of forget that once you start the business, now you have a business to run. And these young folks don't really, it's not a sort of a inherent skill set for people to run a business. So now you have to sort of transform yourself from this startup entrepreneur into a manager. And that also changes the competitive landscape, because now you're on the map, now you're on people's radar, and perhaps depending on the space that you're in, now you have people coming after you, some of whom you may not have expected to be competitors. So not only are you maturing yourself as a business owner, and next week I'm offering up an article on leadership. How do you transform from an entrepreneur into a leader? And what are those skill sets that you need to sort of learn to be able to do that? And some people have that in them already, but again, that's a competitive thing. And it's sort of being able to also embrace your competition is a really important step. That was another really huge learning moment for me, was just being able to reach out to my competitors and say, hey, I'm here. Let's work together to a certain extent. Yeah, we're still competitors, but
Yep.
we can also work together so that we're not cannibalizing each other's space so much.
Yes.
And I think good companies do that. They form those, as we talked about on the business model canvas, those key partners in business. And some of those partners are your competitors,
Yep.
because you're all working in that same space.
Yeah, that's what I find with the playground as well. There's just so much space in the market. It's a very new market, and there's so much space in it still. So that that really makes I don't think about competition in that
Right,
sense. I don't think in about competition in the harsh way of competing. I think about competition as we're all in this space.
right,
We are all different, because that's the thing with games. It's very much differentiable, and it's very easy to differentiate. And there's so many games and so many advantages and so many benefits that you can share in so many different ways. So there's no need to really harshly compete on anything. Let's just build this space up, right?
right,
Let's just build this space up within the coaching community, within the incubator entrepreneurship center community. And I think that is a mindset that could be very beneficial within so many more markets.
for sure. Looks like we're coming to the end here, about two
Yeah.
minutes or so.
Yeah.
Just summarize a little bit. Go ahead, Inge.
Yes. So today we spoke about competition. We spoke about how competition is not always about having the same product, having the same service, and not even about having the same differentiated service somewhere else, or differentiated from your competitors. But sometimes it's really about a competing need, a competing job to be done, competing for discretionary money. And that way, thinking about competition is really not about your skills as a salesman or an entrepreneur, but really about how to find the right need for your particular customer, and how to compete in that sense for the job that they are trying to do. Then we talked about Mike's question, so market feasibility and how to determine it. So we went to customer discovery, and we discussed within customer discovery also new markets. So we discussed the playground for entrepreneurs and other new markets where you might just need to build the space up, and then there's no need to think about competition as harsh competition. Sometimes you might want to work together with your competitors at certain aspects of your business, just to build the market up and to build the space up, and to together get things going. So that was today's session. I think it's good to mention where you can contact us. You can find both of us on LinkedIn. So Tom is promoting his articles, and he is publishing those articles every 2 weeks, if I'm not
Correct.
mistaken,
Yep.
which are very interesting. He goes very deep into several topics of entrepreneurship. Last year, he got a lot of articles about customer discovery, about lean startup, about higher education, and right now it's more about sophomore entrepreneurs and the challenges that they are facing.
You can follow my hashtag sophomore entrepreneurs too, and you can catch those articles and follow along. And I enjoy contributing. And make sure to follow Inge.
Yes. So you can also find me on LinkedIn. Actually, next week I'll have a demo, an interactive demo for the Playground for Entrepreneurs. So if you haven't registered already, you're welcome to do so to experience the game firsthand. I'll try to make it as interactive as possible with an online audience, probably a bit of a bigger audience than we usually have, for it being a board game, a serious board game, in small groups. So we'll have an adjusted dynamic to make it interactive and useful for everybody. So please join, and you can also, of course, send us a message. If there's anything you would like us to discuss or you would like to ask, please don't hesitate to ask in the chat or by private message.
Absolutely.
So thank you for attending. It was great to see you all, as messages are still coming in. And I'm looking forward to the next one.
Yes, so am I. This has been fun.
Great.
Take care, everybody.
Have a good day. Bye-bye.